My name is Harty, and I've been wildlife gardening on an urban plot for the last 14 years. So today what I want to do is give 5 tips for creating an urban wildlife garden. So the first tip is to create no-mow areas. So let's take a look at what they look like. In the no-mow areas, what we've done is created space for wildflowers to emerge. So there's a host of different wildflowers that come up. Wildflowers such as knapweed, orchids, plantain, various other things pushing up through the lawn. And we just left the lawn alone and waited to see what would emerge. So what we've got is a variety of wildflowers that create space for the plants and also then space for pollinating insects and space for all of the other host of insects that come in around that. And that, of course, brings in birds and food for birds. Let's take a look at some of the orchids that we've got around the corner. When we first moved to the garden, there were some orchids growing along the boundary hedge, and I was concerned that when I planted a lot of willow trees there, that they'd overshadow the orchids and we'd lose them. But actually, year on year, not mowing, the orchids have moved out along through the garden, right the way around. They're now right around the front of the house as well. And here they are looking amazing in the lawn. And so they've just spread and spread. They're the most beautiful flowers. Now, the garden is located in Ennis, kind of on the edge of the Burren. So we've got an abundance of wildflowers. And what's really interesting in this garden is the way the plant community evolves and shifts over time. So there's clover has come up in a given year, self-heal in other years, plantain in other years. And so it just shifts and changes over time. And it's a joy every season to just watch what emerges. So tip number 2 is to provide plants that are particularly good for pollinating insects and for birds. So planting specifically for wildlife. When you're bringing in plants into the garden, then consider the plants that are particularly good for other species. So behind me, there's a thornless rose, which is open-hearted. So because it's an open-hearted rose, bees can get at the nectar in the middle of the flower. Whereas with some of the closed varieties, while they look beautiful, it isn't possible for bees and other pollinating insects to get into the flower. Here we also have hawthorn trees. It's a cultivated hawthorn, and there's lots and lots of flowers on the same tree. And so that's something that can be very effective. We also have gooseberries, which again, gooseberries and other fruit bushes are wonderful for fruit for us, but they're also wonderful for wildlife. They've got the flowers for the pollinating insects, and then later in the season, they've got the berries for birds. The third tip is to leave hidden corners for nature. Nature likes its own space. So while the no-mow areas are beside the path, this is an area that we just leave alone completely for nature. So let things emerge, let nettles emerge, let briars emerge, let's see what unfolds, see what happens. Also, having a log pile in a corner so that the insects, woodlice and various things can hide in underneath them is all really, really good for creating space for the insects and then for the birds that feed on them. So leave hidden corners for nature is tip number 3. Tip number 4 is to plant trees. We've looked at the horizontal plane on the ground, but we want to look at the vertical plane next. You can add a lot of interest by expanding on the vertical plane. So by planting trees, you bring that wildlife interest up in towards the air for insects and for birds that feed on them. So we've got hazel, there's rowan, there's elder, there's willow. All those are amazing for wildlife. And even if you've got a very small urban garden, you could maybe plant an apple tree, so you've got the interest for wildlife, and then you've got the food crop as well for yourself. And that can fit into quite a small urban space. And here, even though it's an urban garden, it's quite a big one, but we've got lots of space for well over 100 trees in the garden that are growing and doing their thing and providing a habitat space on that vertical plane for wildlife. So the 5th tip for creating an urban wildlife garden is to construct a pond. So what we've got here are yellow flag iris, watermint, duckweed, and there's lots of other wetland plants that thrive in a small little wildlife pond. And then there's lots of insects that come in, damselflies and dragonflies. Bees will come to drink. And then in the water itself, water boatmen, whirligig beetles, and all the array of aquatic wildlife that lives below the surface of the water. And if you're really lucky, you might get a frog coming in. Birds come and they'll bathe in the pond. And so there's a whole host of activity that happens in a pond that simply wouldn't be there if you didn't invite it all in by creating a small little area of open water. So these are my 5 tips for creating a wildlife-friendly urban garden in your space. I hope you enjoyed them.